Hey guys, welcome to Hughes History. I got Iran-Contra and I'm ready to drop it on you like a rock. Middle school, high school, college, cray-cray on the internet, you're in the right spot. Nothing too fancy, nothing too complex, just some basic general information because everybody should know about this event. So if you listen really carefully, you're gonna hear the door, ding dong, learning's here. So to do Iran-Contra, you have to start with two countries that you would never put together. One of them is Nicaragua in South America, and the other one is Iran in the Middle East. And these two countries are going to come together to help us form this scandal known as Iran-Contra. Iran-Contra technically is around 82, 83, 84, 85, kind of in the early 80s, and 1986 in November is when it explodes into a full-blown scandal in the media. So let's take each country and look a little bit at the basic historical facts about American involvement in those countries, and then we'll kind of bring those two events together and talk about how Iran-Contra occurred. So let's go. Let's start with eeny, meeny, mightty, mo, Nicaragua by the toe. So to understand Nicaragua, you want to start in the early 1800s, 1823, with Monroe Doctrine. This, of course, is the sphere of influence policy that is going to put at least Latin America and South America on the American radar in terms of our self-interest and protecting really economic interests down there. So even in the 19th century, I believe the Marines went to Nicaragua a couple times in order to stabilize the government, which really, in reality, means to make sure that they are pro-American. And then the Somoza regime, I think like 1930s, becomes really, I don't want to say like the puppet of the American government, but the forces that we definitely are supporting down there. So that stays the same all the way through, you know, the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. And then in 1979, there is a revolution by the Sandinistas, named after the previous president who was assassinated by Somoza in the 1930s. I'm going in the weeds here. We got to stick to the basics, right? So the Sandinistas made up the new government of Nicaragua, and they were leftists. They were socialists. They were, in the eyes of many Americans, communists. So first, Jimmy Carter dealt with them, but then quickly we have the 1980 election and Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan is interested in really what's going to become known as the Reagan Doctrine, which, like the Eisenhower Doctrine, kind of a domino theory-ish kind of thing, believes that you need to support democratic forces around the world in order to stop the stem or the flow of communism. So that group becomes the Contras. The Contras were the former regime, not just the former regime, but people that were against the Sandinistas, and that's everybody from the elite and the business groups, the former National Guard and the military people that have lost favor because they didn't support this new regime, as well as probably some landowners that felt they were getting screwed by the new land policies that are leftist and collective, and they nationalized the economy, so a lot of people are going to lose in that situation. So the Contras become the anti-Sandinista group. And that group, the Contras, had some wicked players in it. So if you're looking at this from a neutral standpoint, you're wanting to point out that the Contras are human rights abusers, and that they use rape, and they use killing civilians and going after health care facilities and those types of things. They're on a watch list. But Reagan sees them as anti-communists, therefore he wants to find a way to support them. The problem is Congress has passed something called the Boland Amendment. If you want any vocab, I guess that would be it right there. And this is basically kind of a line in the sand that is saying to the president, we control foreign policy as much as you execute it. So in line with like the War Powers Act, where you're trying to kind of have some congressional or legislative oversight and power when it comes to foreign policy, they're saying we don't want American, money going to the Contras in order to instigate some sort of revolution and really be the hands or the puppeteer hands that create a war. We don't want to do that. So that's one side of the picture, right? You're Reagan, you want to fund these guys, you want to fund the Contras, the Sandinistas are in power in Nicaragua, and then we have to kind of stop there and move on to Iran. What's going on? It's cats eating dogs. So, Iran, right? Not a lot of historical background here. Basic stuff, but the CIA had supported the revolution in the 1950s that had put in the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran was seen as pro-American, more of a secularist, and he ran that country all the way up to 1979, the same year that the Sandinistas took over Nicaragua. And then in 1979, there's the Islamic Revolution, and the Ayatollah Khomeini takes power, and he's very anti-American. And at the same time, and this is really important because it explains Iran-Contra, Hezbollah, which is an Iran-supported terrorist group in Lebanon, had taken 7 American hostages. So Reagan is trying to deal with a very anti-American government in Iran, and at the same time find a way to get these hostages released. And there's an opportunity that's going to arise, because you need to know this, that Iran is involved in the Iran-Iraq war. So I think that Reagan, and we're going to talk about it in a second, but Oliver North and some of the other players in here, what's the other guy's name? Poindexter. Is it Poindexter? His really name is Poindexter. But these guys are going to see an opportunity in fulfilling some of Iran's needs and American needs, and at the same time getting Nicaragua involved in the Contras. So now that we have some really basic ideas, right, our position in Nicaragua and our position in Iran and these hostages in Lebanon, we can advance to the Iran-Contra scandal. So 1947, this is funny, every time I talk about something I'm like, we gotta go back in time, because history explains everything. But the 1947 National Security Act, signed by Harry Truman, created the National Security Council, which is really kind of an executive branchish kind of thing that is going to facilitate the president in matters of foreign policy. And that had stayed sort of independent and between legislative executive worlds up to really the Bay of Pigs. And then after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy sees the National Security Council and the CIA is kind of going rogue. So he brings that under executive control a little bit more. So that might have in the long run been a mistake, because now the president, in a sense, has operational command of covert action that can exist outside of checks and balances. And I think that's really where Iran-Contra begins, is understanding that this National Security Council, who is going to hire Oliver North, and that's a big guy in this position, and he becomes the political liaison, or military political liaison for the National Security Council. So he's operating in a very kind of like, what is it, a government action, a government sense, or is he a spy, or is he a political agent? I'm not exactly sure what he is, but he's really the guy who is mechanically in charge of executing the president's wishes. And one of the president's wishes, and there's 2, is free the hostages and get the Contras funding. And not many people talk about this, but the Contras got fundings from other sources other than what we're going to talk about. Saudi Arabia had given millions of dollars to the Contras, and Oliver North is kind of existing with the Bolden Amendment. So while the Bolden Amendment, specifically forbids sending government money to the Contras, Oliver North, executing in his mind the president's wishes, is finding other ways to do that. Not to have the government do it, but really to have third-party players do it. So what Iran-Contra at the end of the day means is that Oliver North had facilitated weapons sales to Iran. And that's kind of a shocker, because Iran is anti-American. So here's Reagan in one sense going, we're never going to deal with terrorists. And on the other hand, he's either approving or knowing, or people under him are selling weapons to Iran. Now, they're not selling them directly from America. They did a little bit later in the scandal, but early on they were going through Israel. Israel was sending them, I think it was like anti-tank artillery weapons, Tom, I think the initials were, or something like that. And then we would give the weapons to Israel that they had given to Iran, and then the excess profits and the markup on that money was being funneled to the Contras, and in a sense behind the Bolden Amendment, behind Congress's back. And really this all blows up in 1986. And we could talk forever about this. There's a lot of other details that if you're researching, you should research. But just the basic plot is, in 1986, and by the way, Iran released some of the hostages. Not they did, but Hezbollah did. And that was seen as Reagan as a win, that he had facilitated the releasing of these hostages. And on the same hand, he was arguing that this arms was going not against the United States, was going into the Iran-Iraq war, and having those guys fights, in a sense, helps us because they're keeping their eye off us and they're just kind of wasting their energy on each other. And also there were some moderate forces in Iran that I think North and some of the Reagan officials believe could be worked with, and this was a good idea to have some type of open dialogue with Iran. I'm going in the weeds! So let's now look at what transpires into Iran-Contra in the media. So the story's broken. It's like November 3rd, it's 1986, congressional elections are coming up, and this is kind of like the big news before the elections. I think it was a press agency in Lebanon, and yada yada yada, had finally gotten the story out because I think the Sandinistas had shot down one of these planes that was carrying, the supplies to the Contras, and it really finally blows up into a congressional investigation. And that becomes big news, and Reagan had denied any culpability, that he didn't know anything, and then later it was found out when, I think it was Caspar Weinberger, or one of the guys was interviewing or talking to Reagan when Reagan was in the hospital, and he had said on his testimony that Reagan had at least known that the Iranians were getting arms from Israel that we approved because Israel wouldn't do it without our knowledge. I'm going in the weeds. But at the end of the day, it's really the testimony of Oliver North that kind of captures the American audience attention, and it really becomes kind of Congress versus the president, executive branch, in executing foreign policy. And at the end of the day, there was something called the Tower Commission that Reagan had appointed, and Congress ran its own commission. It was independent counsel, and they all basically came to the conclusion that these guys broke the law, that maybe Reagan knew, maybe he didn't, but at least he had mismanaged the situation. But all of these guys, not all of them, but most of them were convicted and indicted and convicted of breaking the law and lying to Congress. Bush, who was vice president, then became president, and he pardoned the guys who hadn't got their cases reversed on appeal. So that's Iran-Contra. How crazy is that? So how easy is that, right? There you go. Oliver North, working for the National Security Council, facilitates a deal where Israel sells weapons to Iran engaged in the Iran-Iraq war, who then in return frees American hostages held by Hezbollah, and that money is then taken at an inflated cost into a secret deal where we funnel it to Nicaragua and we fund the Contras. But that violates the Bolden Amendment. Oh, Iran-Contra. At the end of the day, this really, I think, exposes a lot about covert operations and executive power and legislative power, and really who's in control of that. And of course, that conversation exists today. So there you go. Hopefully you're not a dummy anymore. You never were a dummy. Hughes was kidding. Iran-Contra. So there you go, guys. I am done. Make sure you click the description below and check out all the other awesome EDU channels. And if you haven't subscribed, you could win a pony. A pony. All you gotta do is subscribe. So do that, and remember, where attention goes, energy flows. I'm out of here.